telling you guys about the land ordinance of 1785. What Congress was doing, of course, was beginning to determine the landscape essentially by beginning to survey it. And so I told you that they started at a particular place where the Ohio River crossed through the boundary of Pennsylvania. They made these baselines, of course, around east-west, the meridians, and then that would allow them to connect it all together kind of with these big things called townships that weren't necessarily a real town. They could become that, but just simply these areas, the determined areas essentially. So the townships would then be subdivided, and they would turn them into, they were 36 square miles, that's how big they were, so they were turned into 36 square mile units. So I'm not doing that perfectly at all, let's just pretend, of course, that there's 36 of those. Now each individual unit was 640 acres. I'm going to do that, I actually have this for you. Okay. Each individual unit, so there's 36 of them, of course, in any particular, in these townships, were going to be called sections. And the sections were 640 acres. So this becomes the base kind of distribution unit as far as the land ordinance is concerned. So you've got these little sections, and of course each one's 640. Now, there's always this intriguing component of how the government is going to manage these lands. So, as I write down here on the bottom, of course, I hope you can see, they're going to sell the land for $1 an acre. And that sounds really good because that makes it sound like anybody can buy quite a bit of land. Oops, going the wrong way here. So anybody can buy quite a bit of land. But the only problem is that they didn't want to sell it by the acre because, that would mean that there'd be, I don't know what it would be, maybe billions, of course, of sales that would have to take place over the course of westward expansion. So instead they decided to sell it by the section. So that means that instead of like the minimum purchase price being $1 for the average American, the minimum purchase price was $640. And by doing this, they're making a social decision essentially, and that is that the common people can't buy this land, right? Only the wealthy people can. So it creates the foundation for what we call the land speculation frontier. These entrepreneurs that would, of course, go to the West, they would begin to buy this land from the government, they would develop the land, critical role, I'll tell you about that in westward expansion, but it also meant, of course, that they would be able to take economic advantage of. They're going to buy the land, the wealthy people are, they subdivide it, they then finally get it, sell it at some other price, of course, to the average American. But one of the things they're going to do, of course, is they're going to create this system of surveying, this grid. It becomes basically a monster grid. It is laid upon almost the entire United States of America. Of course, not the East Coast, because that was already done. But it stretches across the rest of it. And I always think that when you're going on the flyover states, and you're looking down, you see it. The section lines become the road lines, the fence lines, the edge of the ranch, the edge of the farm. You're looking down upon these base units. And so they create a system that is very rational, that is very effective, of course, and allows for Americans to begin to go out there. And if you look on whatever you live on, that place of land, that will be determined using this system. You live in range something township, this, whatever, section, whatever. Each one of them, are subdivided in these particular kind of ways. So they create a very rational system which allows then Americans to go west, of course, and to begin to purchase the land and begin to develop it. Now this, the surveying is critical, and it's a critical part, but the most important part of the Western Lands Policy established by the Continental Congress, by Congress, was something called the Northwest Ordinance that was implemented in 1787. Ironically, that's the year that's the beginning of the end of the Confederation government. But the most important thing they're going to do is the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay, whereas the land ordinance kind of it determined the way that the land would be settled, essentially, just how people would be able to move on to it. What the Northwest Ordinance is going to do is determine the political development of the West. How will it become part of the United States of America? This becomes, this is going to be a huge issue, okay? So what the Northwest Ordinance did was it took one part of the West. Let me get my map back here. And let's just scooch in just a bit on that map. Okay. So the northwest was just this area right here. So here's the Ohio River. So this area right here, and of course, when they say northwest, we have to understand that that was the northwest of the United States. Go just a little bit more. That was the northwest of the United States at that time. Of course, today when we think of the northwest, we think of all the way out here to Washington and Oregon. But this was the original northwestern part of the United States. And by the way, there is a university in Chicago called Northwestern, which of course is an indication of that original location. So this area right here, which of course was undeveloped and basically undefined, essentially, would be dealt with. And the idea was to create the model for the rest of Western development, to see exactly how this will all work itself out. So this land right here, so here's the Ohio River, here's the Mississippi, all that, it's called the Old Northwest, but this was the area that would be dealt with through the Northwest Ordinance. So Congress was going to ask a number of questions, and answer a number of questions about how this area will ultimately be developed. Let me go back out again. So the first question is, how many states are there going to be in this particular area? And what they were thinking, I think, was that there had to be like an ideal size in terms of a state. I'm pretty sure they thought that states like Connecticut and Rhode Island were just too small. You guys can barely even see them right here, okay? But Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, those are like a good size. So they decided, let's make a kind of a nicer size in terms of the state. So they made a determination that there could be no fewer than 3 or no more than 5 states. That's the way that they'll work this. So no fewer than 3 and no more than 5. And how many states will actually appear in this particular area? I'll give you 1, 2, 3. It was indeed 5. It's going to be 5 states that are going to become this particular part of the Northwest. So that will be Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. A little bit of the Pacific Northwest was or the Northwest Territory was indeed what you and I would call Minnesota. But the primary areas are going to be those particular. It was the homeland of the Big Ten. That's the Big Ten Conference. That's their location. Okay. So, and the way it would work is the people would move into the areas. Of course, they had a sense of how big their state could be. They'll have to make a determination of their boundary. First place ever settled, of course, is going to be Ohio, and they're going to make, okay, so this is about how big we should be, and then the people of Indiana, that's how big we should be, and then Michigan, kind of the way they're going to have to do this thing. Okay. So the first thing is how many states, and of course, and by the way, as you go to the west, you notice the states get larger and larger. And the primary issue is not necessarily geography, it's more like population. Can you find enough people to make a state? And these areas were relatively sparsely populated for a long time, so they had to kind of be substantial to gain enough population so they could begin to create the foundation of statehood. It's not that they necessarily wanted to be so much bigger, it's the nature of the landscape out here, of course. Relatively arid lands, a much more kind of broad, open area. Okay, so question number 1, how many states will there be? It's going to have to be no more than 3, no less than 3, excuse me, no more than 5, and it will indeed be 5. The second part of the Northwest Ordinance, and really the most important part, was how would these areas become states? Now the first thing I need you to know is that the assumption is that the West will be politically developed and become just like the East Coast was. The first thing that creates the United States of America are the states, and so they thought this is a good idea, let's keep it up, let's keep adding more states onto it. So they had to figure out, okay, so areas are getting settled and determine how will they actually become states. And they did this basically through a formula, and here's how it goes. As soon as there were 5,000 people in an area, and 5,000, was just perceived as the base number of kind of creating a functioning political entity. As soon as there were 5,000 people in the state, then that area could become what they called a territory. Now, that T should be a capital, okay, because this is an official status of the United States of America. Territories are something that we actually still have to this day, although the territories of today are interestingly problematic in some ways. They don't really fit the model, right? So 5,000 people would allow you to become a territory. And what you're doing here in this moment is you're determining the boundaries of your location, of course, and you're then applying for territorial status. Territories are officially recognized by our government. They are kind of like a state in training. They're not a state. They're like a state in training. And so the territory will have, among other things, oh, thought I was getting a weird flash. Territories will have, among other things, a constitution. Every territory had to have a constitution. Every territory would have a governor. Every territory would have a legislature. These are all things that, of course, a state would have, that you're supposed to have. Every territory would be allowed to send representatives to Washington, D.C. Now, they could be there, they could debate, they could discuss, but they couldn't vote. They weren't states yet, so they don't get to vote. So it's kind of like being a state in training. Now, I'm sure when they did this, the assumption was that every territory will ultimately become a state. So this is like just step 1. I do want you to know that the territories of today that don't fit the model are, of course, Guam and Puerto Rico. And you know, the one that's most interesting is Puerto Rico, because it has a very substantial population. But Puerto Rico's in this very interesting situation. There are those in Puerto Rico who would prefer to be an independent country. There were those in Puerto Rico who wanted to be a state of the United States. And there are those in Puerto Rico who wanted to be simply what it is. You know, it's this kind of interesting situation. You know, they are part of the United States, but they're not necessarily fully have all the benefits of the United States. They can come to the United States whenever they want to, of course. But we've seen, you know, with the hurricane that this, you know, this can be problematic in terms of how exactly it's going to work out for them. So please understand that the territories of Guam and Puerto Rico are modern phenomena that don't really fit the historical model. Anyway, the assumption always was that the territory would become a state. And indeed, in the contiguous area of the United States, and with Alaska and, of course, Hawaii, that's exactly what's going to happen. Now, they assumed the population would grow. And so when the population got to 60,000, then the territory could reapply to Congress to become a state. And of course, almost all of the states of the West are going to absolutely go through this process. There are only a couple of them that won't do that, of course. California didn't because so many people came so quickly with the gold rush that it didn't make sense to become a territory. And they applied directly to become a state. And Texas was pretty much the same kind of story. So anyway, once you had 60,000 people, you were now a state. Now, the thing that is so important to me about this is that you could, in this moment, there's all these counter scenarios that could have developed. I told you about the mega states, that could have happened, okay? But here's another one. It could have been that those 13 original states would simply decide that they are the dominant states of America and that they will rule America forever. Now, we do recognize their importance through the stripes on our flag, right? But what we do is we create a system where every state that comes in is full and equal. You know, has all the same rights and privileges of any other kind of state. There's no problem with being a state that came in later into the story. And the reason that, you know, we especially should appreciate this is that by doing this, by allowing every state to realize its own potential, you allow, like the state of California, to become truly the greatest state of the United States of America. We have the most people, we have the greatest economy, we have the most political representation. I mean, we are truly the greatest state. And there could have been a situation where the, you know, Virginians and people of Massachusetts said, no, you know, we're going to be the dominant people forever. They didn't set it up that way, though. They allowed every state to come in and be all that it could be as far as being a state. And I do think that that's really powerful, especially when you think about people like us in California who are able to fully develop our potential in the future. I do want you to know that there are other interesting parts of the Northwest Ordinance. There were rights that were guaranteed to the people who lived there, and this is before the Bill of Rights. The freedom of religion, the right to a trial by a jury of your peers, the right of habeas corpus. They can't just throw you in jail and throw away the key, basically. They have to, of course, they have to indict you and all those other things you have to do. And I do want you to also know that the Northwest Ordinance basically did kind of guarantee education. In the grid I told you about here, and the grid's gone, they left the 16th section of every township to support public school. So it's kind of like suggesting that this land is put aside for the people, for the children, of course, of the area, and will somehow support the public school. And then, although it's very small, it's a really big deal. The 14th Amendment, jumped way out of line there. The Northwest Ordinance also, for the first time, jumping into something that's similar or related though, it prohibited slavery. The Northwest Territory is the first area in the nation that will not allow slavery. And it shows both the northern attitude against slavery, of course, and that slavery is becoming kind of an issue in the minds of many Americans. So this area will never have slavery, and that right there is a powerful differentiation. So the Northwest Ordinance, by creating the structure of the political formation of the states, becomes critical for the development. And you know, as America continues to go west, and westward expansion is a huge phenomenon, really one of the big phenomena of the rest of our class. You know, you will see this process at work. People moving in, defining an area, becoming a territory, and ultimately, of course, becoming a state. And the last one to do that, of course, in the contiguous area was Arizona, and I think it was 1911, if I'm not mistaken. They finally had enough people in Arizona in 1911 that they could apply for statehood. So there were certain things that the Confederation Congress did that were pretty important. I mean, those things are going to have a huge impact in the long story as far as America is concerned. But of course, I'm sure you know that, you know, this is a weak situation, and I'm going to focus ultimately on the weaknesses, and we see that this is going to kind of begin to fall apart. Do understand that the Confederation government was weak by design. Remember, it's weak by design. But sometimes, you know, the design became kind of overwhelming and problems really began to develop, especially as we go a little bit later into the 1780s. So let me just suggest some of the issues that began to be a problem. One was that the government was always poor, and the government was always begging for money, and so it could never, you know, it was always struggling to kind of one way or the other to sustain itself. Another problem was it couldn't sustain a money supply. That was one of its particular tasks. And you know, there was a saying of that era that it's not worth a continental, and so the continental was the continental dollar. It's like the monetary unit of that time. And you know, that by saying it's not worth a continental, you're saying it's worthless. And the money that was provided by the government was pretty much, there's no foundation for it whatsoever. And most states began to function with their own currencies. They would have their own monetary units within their boundaries, which of course became problematic when you're trying to create trade that would go across all of the individual states. The biggest problem, though, was that the states simply began to go their own way. It's like they didn't care about the federal government, and sometimes they didn't even send anyone to Washington, or it's not even Washington. They didn't send anyone into the federal government to Congress, you know. And the states were going their own way, and the states were conducting their own Indian affairs, and the states were conducting their own foreign affairs, and some of them had their own military. You could have been an admiral in the Navy of South Carolina. South Carolina had its own little navy. So, and you know, many Americans thought this is fine, you know. We're all focused on the states. The states are the critical thing, and it doesn't matter if the individual states begin to drift apart. It's not that important. We'll keep our loose ties through the Congress and the rest of it, and we'll just let it go. Okay. Now, not everyone was happy with the situation, and there was very much a particular group of Americans who were very unhappy, to be honest with you. Now, the small group that became increasingly concerned will ultimately become known as the Founding Fathers. And in many ways, when I think of Founding Fathers, I don't think so much about the founders of the Republic. I think, well, I mean, founders of America, of the United States. I think more like they're the founders of the Constitution. They're founding the nation, the way that the nation will function, essentially. And so there was a small group of these people, not a whole bunch of them. The important point is they're not many, but they're important people. So there are people like George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton and others, you know, who didn't like the way that it was all progressing. They began to see that these 13 states were all going to drift apart, and maybe at one point, of course, disunite absolutely, and who knows what that would lead to, of course. And their inability to protect themselves perhaps from other European countries, all these things would begin to be generated. Now, this general feeling of this group, and they were important, they were connected to Congress, many of them were members of Congress, of course, would ultimately have an outcome. And so what they did was they began to lobby the rest of Congress to try to fix the situation, perceiving the Confederation as being too weak and thinking something needed to be done to fix that. And they were able to get Congress to go along to a degree. Congress allowed them to call for a convention. And Congress allowed that convention, their commission, to revise and strengthen the Articles of Confederation. So they're given the power to reevaluate the situation and revise and strengthen, although there's nothing in here that says you can get rid of the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. So what this will lead to is that there will be a calling for a convention to be held. And they tried the first time in 1786, and there's a call for a convention to be held in Annapolis, and that's in Maryland. And when the convention is supposed to meet, it's like 5 people show up, and you know, nothing happens there, okay? And so they try again. They're going to call this time, they're going to call for a convention to be met in Philadelphia in 1787. And that one's going to work. And I've always wondered, you know, why didn't it work in Annapolis and why did it work in Philadelphia? And here's my speculation on it. In Annapolis, the kind of thing they got going on, like for lunch, is a crab sandwich, the blue crab sandwich, and that's okay. But in Philadelphia, there's a Philly cheesesteak, and yeah, let's go there, okay? So anyway, there will ultimately be a convention, and we're going to just call it the convention, the most important political meeting in the history of the United States of America, to be held in Philadelphia from September to May of 1787. And this is really just this critical moment because it is that moment of the birth of our modern governing apparatus. This is the moment of the birth of the Constitution. So the convention is called, the delegates will come to it, of course, and things are going to happen in a very, very powerful way. Now, you know, just a little bit about the convention itself. Ultimately, 55 Americans will come, and of course they were all white men. It's just the way it was in those days. It's a diverse population, but the power establishment was absolutely in the hands of white men. I always like to mention kind of like who was there. By the way, I want you to know there are 55 total. Many of them left though, and so we have like 36 of a core group of people who are really going to make this thing happen. Meeting in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. If you guys ever go there, of course, it's cool. You go in there and you get, it's both the location, of course, of the Declaration of Independence, and it's also the location of the Constitution. But, it becomes kind of interesting to see who's there. And there were a lot of stars of America there. George Washington's there. I'll talk about that in just a second. Benjamin Franklin, I already told you he was there. Alexander Hamilton's there. A number of critically kind of important Americans are there. It's also interesting to note who's not there. And so John Adams was the ambassador to Great Britain. He's not there. And maybe more importantly, Thomas Jefferson's not there. Jefferson is an extraordinary intellectual. He's off in Paris. He is the ambassador to France at that time. So, but there's still, these were, important Americans, James Madison, all these guys that are going to be there, and they're going to be involved in this, moment of creation where they're going to transform the nature of America, especially in terms of its national government. So their first significant day of activity was on May the 24th. And on that day, they make two critical decisions about how they're going to proceed from that point forward, all right? And the two things that they decided that are very important is, number one, that they are going to elect George Washington to be their presiding officer. Now, I want to just, unpack this one just a little bit because it's interestingly important. George Washington was not a major political theorist, and George Washington was not a major debater. I think I told you about all his problems with his teeth. That pretty much wasn't his thing. But here's the thing: he just had so much prestige. He had eclipsed Benjamin Franklin as the most famous American by far. He was already being seen as the father of the country through his heroic efforts in terms of the American Revolution. And just having him there, and then having him be the presiding officer, was fundamentally important. I mean, if he hadn't been there, a lot of Americans would have dismissed the situation. But the very fact that he was there, you mean George was there and Washington was, they're going to say, oh, that's a big deal. That's an important thing that's happening here. Now, I do need to tell you this, he did little, really, during the entire convention. So he was the presiding officer, so he'd get up every day, bang the gavel, and make sure that everything's called to order. And then he handed the gavel over to a man by the name of Nathaniel Gorham. And Nathaniel Gorham was an expert in parliamentary procedure, so he would then run the actual proceedings. And George would go sit off in the corner. And I got to tell you, it must have been super hot. This is the summertime in Philadelphia, and they're going to close the windows and the doors. I just feel like people sweating and just, a really difficult kind of situation. And part of the word is that George would be over there taking a nap. He'd fall asleep because it was long and kind of tedious activities that were taking place. But I do need to tell you this, that when the moments were important, he was alert and awake and paying attention. And all he had to do, he didn't even have to really say anything. He just had to kind of nod his head. If he thought it was a bad idea, and everybody like, ooh, damn, George doesn't like that, that's not going to happen. But if he thought it was a good idea, oh, George is okay with this, let's move on, that kind of thing. So the election of Washington, the positioning of Washington as the presiding officer gave this extraordinary dignity and importance to the activity, of course, and made, it was critical. If the American people, I don't know, I'm already going to tell you the Americans are going to be hostile to this in some way, but if he hadn't been there, I think it would have been a very different situation. Then the other thing I want you to know is that they decided to proceed in secrecy. That's really, really interesting. They were not going to let people know what they were doing. And if you think about it, the nature of representative government is often to focus on the issue of transparency. We, the people, should know what the heck is going on, okay? But there's something going on here that you kind of need to understand. This is sort of like a coup d'etat. This is one of the interesting historical interpretive issues. So what was happening with the Confederation in the early years of the Republic was that there's quite a democratic explosion. You kind of lose that sense of the elite. You have these new people, new men rising up. Some of these elite members didn't like it. James Madison, said, when the pot boils, the scum rises. So not everyone was super happy that we're having an increasingly democratic situation. And on the state level, new men, people who'd just been part of the middle class, could really express themselves and begin to be important people within the state. But those that had been the old elites, they're not terribly happy about this. They want to kind of hold on to their relative power. So there's an argument that the Constitution is like a coup d'etat. You're trying to diverge the revolution. It's going into too much of a revolutionary direction, too democratic direction. We need to reestablish this and make sure that the elites, us, those of us that have been kind of the leaders throughout the colonial period and into the Republican period, we should be the dominant elements. And their notion was that because they were more famous and more well known, even though they might not be able to assert their sway on the state level, they could definitely dominate at the national level. And in many ways, they're absolutely right. They're going to create a government that will elect 6 in a row of these guys. We got Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then and it's John Quincy Adams, who's actually the son, of course, of John Adams. So, you have this colonial elite kind of retaining relative power, although they are creating a governing apparatus that is involving other people and is relatively democratic. But their notion was that if people knew exactly what they were doing, they might not be that happy. So instead, let us proceed in secrecy. Would allow us, freedom of discussion. We can slay the sacred cow. We can say whatever we want without the feeling. You all know that when the cameras go on, everything changes, right? It's a very different situation for any kind of political debate. Rather the candidness, of course, if they're just talking in some kind of more private situation. But it is this attempt on the part of these founding fathers to kind of transform the dynamic of America. Instead of going for this state thing and all this democracy, we're going to go more to the national situation, which will maybe give the elites a continuing situation of relative power. So anyway, they're going to proceed in secrecy. And I think the most impressive part of the story was that they did that. These were men of honor. They didn't tell. And even those who left didn't tell. They kept it secret during the entire period here, because, once they had made that decision, they're going to have to kind of adhere to that. Okay, so the convention gets underway, and the first significant order of business is the presentation of this extraordinarily important thing called the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan is a potential identification for the final exam. And one thing I always like to tell you guys, that it will be on the test. I need to test you on the Constitution, so I guarantee you that this is going to be on the test. So I hope that you pay attention to this one, because this is going to be kind of critical, and it's a gimme. It's one that you absolutely know is going to be on the test. We'll be there for you, okay? All right, so the Virginia Plan is presented. And the important thing about the Virginia Plan is I have it right here. This is the blueprint of the Constitution. So what we are seeing emerging in the Virginia Plan is what will become the Constitution of the United States of America. So Virginia Plan becomes sort of critical. The Virginia Plan was presented by the state of Virginia, and like everything is meaningful here. This could not have come from Rhode Island. Nobody would have respected that. It couldn't have come from Massachusetts. Massachusetts was a little too crazy and radical. It had to come from the oldest, most powerful, and most distinguished of the states, and that, of course, was Virginia. So it's called the Virginia Plan, and there's meaning there that it's coming from Virginia. Now, it was presented by the senior delegate from the Virginia, senior member of the Virginia delegation. The actual senior member would have been Washington, but Washington, of course, is the presiding officer, and he doesn't want to do that anyway. So the man that will present the Virginia Plan was named Edmund Randolph, and he's one of these first families of Virginia, big-time Virginia people. Now, Edmund Randolph is indeed the presenter of the plan, but I need you to know that he is not, he's not, and by the way, it's sometimes called the Randolph Plan. That's an alternative way of understanding this. But the critical person behind this is James Madison. James Madison was the author of the Virginia Plan. He was a junior member. He was 36 years old at this moment, of course. Little guy. I don't know if you guys know, he becomes the shortest president in American history. I think he was 5'2", about 120 pounds or something like that. Just a little guy, but a scrapper, what can I say? And extraordinarily intelligent. He had treated the convention as if it was some scholarly activity, and written a huge paper, of course, a treatise. He's going to bring this, of course, with an intent to transform the nature of the government. Because he is the author of the Virginia Plan, James Madison is often known as the father of the Constitution, not in an appropriate way. We also know that he was the man taking just copious notes at this time, the minutes of it. So much of what happened in the convention comes to us from the observations of James Madison. So any way you look at this guy's critically important as far as the Constitution is concerned. So what he does is he puts together this thing that we're going to call the Virginia Plan. And of course, in total, it is all the components of what will become the Constitution, well, at least those that are in the original presentation. But what I want to do is present to you what I think are the four most important points that are being brought forward by the Virginia Plan. So here we go, and here's number one. And the first thing is that they're going to get rid of the Articles. The Virginia Plan calls for the scrapping of the Articles of the Confederation. Now I want you to know that this was a radical move at the very beginning of this convention, and I'm sure it freaked a whole bunch of people out. Congress had authorized the convention to revise and strengthen the Articles of the Confederation. Congress never said, that you have the right to get rid of this. So this is like the coup d'etat. No, it's dysfunctional. It doesn't work. We're going to get rid of this sucker. Okay. I only imagine that as Randolph is reading this, a whole bunch of people are kind of squirming in their seats, going, "Holy crap! What's all this about?" Okay. The second thing I want you to be aware of in the Virginia Plan is that it calls for a stronger, more centralized government. So right now, I'm telling you that they are going absolutely against those initial notions of the Americans who sought will try to avoid a strong centralized government, and indeed hope to retain the power in this individual states. And here comes the Virginia Plan and says, nah, that doesn't work, okay? We need to create a national government that is strong and centralized, that can sustain us, of course, and sustain the economy and take us into the future. So they are basically rejecting a basic tenet of the early period of the Republic. Americans focused on the weak decentralized government, and here we are going towards a strong centralized government. This would be done. And the third part that I want to highlight for you in terms of what he's going to present, what the Virginia Plan presents, is that it will be done through the creation of a three-branch system of government, the three branches of government. And I want you to know that the Americans do not invent this situation. Can't tell if I'm getting something weird now. Okay, you guys, I think I got a problem again, so I'm going to tag out.